Hello and welcome to our webinar, Cunning Strategies for Effective Working on QA Teams. I'm Simon Knight, the presenter for this session. Just a little bit about me. There I am. I'm the TestRail product manager. Prior to managing the TestRail product, I was a tester, a test manager, a testing coach. I've spoken at various conferences, written a lot of testing related articles and material, along with workshops and training for various folk. If you want to find me online, you can do so via Twitter or LinkedIn at the links below. All right, so just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started with the webinar proper. We are planning on a 60-minute webinar today, thereabouts. If you've got questions during the webinar, then you can use the Q&A panel in the GoToWebinar console, which is normally on the top right-hand side of the GoToWebinar screen. This webinar is being recorded, and everyone registered will receive a follow-up email with a link to watch the recording or share it with others in your organization. Okay, so we're going to get stuck straight in, and I think it probably goes without saying, although I'm going to say it anyway, the coronavirus outbreak that we're experiencing at present is seeing a lot of us go through something of a rough patch at the moment. For lots of you on this webinar, that may mean that you've been thrust into the position of working remotely with little or no preparation in advance. Working remotely can present quite significant challenges, even at the best of times. And if you're used to having your colleagues around you and being able to simply bounce ideas around easily, or rely on your teammates around you for support by virtue of simply being able to lean in, ask a question, and get a more or less immediate response, or have some kind of quick discussion about whatever challenges you're experiencing. Clearly, those kind of interactions, the friendly, jovial office environment, we can see on the slide there, that's just not available to you in quite the same way. And it may not be available to you for a little while yet, depending on your specific circumstances in your country and your geography. One piece of good news that you do have in your favor, though, is that we are all in it together. It used to be that one of the main challenges with remote working was other people in the office who weren't remote working. And because they weren't remote working, they didn't understand or fully appreciate what it was like to be on the other end of a Slack channel or a Zoom meeting or Skype or whatever it was, while they were all in the same meeting room or in a stand-up or crowded around a desk together. Remote working is, at least for the present, the new normal. Still, depending on the specifics of your particular situation, you may still be experiencing a whole host of problems. Probably, certainly in my experience, a lot of those problems that you may be experiencing are fairly common. And again, in my experience, most of them will fall into 2 or 3 main categories. And we'll come to what those are shortly. So during this webinar, we're going to explore some of the issues that testers and individual contributors generally and teams run into when they're working remotely, particularly when remote working is a new or an externally imposed experience, like it is for many of you currently. As we do that, as we run through those issues, you'll probably observe that, as I've already mentioned, a lot of them fall into several broad categories. And in case those aren't obvious by the time we're done, I'll be sure to illustrate them in no uncertain terms before moving on to showing you some tips and some tricks for how to overcome those challenges. Once we're done with all of that, hopefully there'll be some time for Q&A. Okay, so some time ago, in response to an article by the great Lisa Crispin, author of Agile Testing and many other works, Lisa wrote an article about some struggles that she was having with remote working at her current gig. And I saw her article and I responded to it with some of my own experiences of working remotely. Since I've worked remotely for quite a long time and have done it, I think, with some measure of success. Now, I'm not going to go through those articles verbatim in this webinar. Suffice to say that I did identify the following areas as being kind of key challenges for remote workers at the time, way back in 2018, which probably seems like quite a long time ago now. So those key challenges at that time were, I think, having a good, dedicated, quiet, well-equipped place in which to work, having the right software or hardware tools with which to do your work, having access to the right information at the right time, getting feedback, knowing whether your activities were having the desired effect or not, being able to make decisions, timely decisions, feeling empowered to make the right decisions, or vice versa, feeling blocked, not having the right information to be able to move forward, or not feeling empowered to be able to make a decision. Attention management, being able to stay focused on valuable activities for reasonable durations of time. And visibility and managing up, being or not being seen by the rest of your team and your management, setting people's expectations around your deliverables, that kind of stuff. And I think probably those are the same kinds of issues that remote working testers and other individual other individual contributors and team members and indeed managers are facing today. Certainly judging by the flurry of remote working blog posts and articles that I've seen over the last few weeks by various well-known and lesser well-known testers, some of whom write for our own TestRail and RunnerX blogs, so people like Michael Larson, Pete Whalen, Matt Heuser, for example. I think this is kind of a key issue for a lot of people right now. So the example challenges that I've already cited so far are really have really been focused on individual contributors, so testers, testing team members. But if we would stop to think about some of them from more of a management perspective, then we might end up with some items like trust and performance, or having confidence that your team is doing what you expect them to when you expect them to do it. Collaboration and communication, having systems and processes in place to support and get the best work out of your people. And tooling, again, having the right software and hardware to underpin all of the work that needs to get done. Or to put all of those another way, making sure that people have all of the right tools, all of the right skills to do their jobs effectively, and not instead fall into the trap of, spending all their time watching daytime TV, or, spending it all on Facebook or Twitter instead. Basically, making sure that your people are able to do their work effectively with all of the information, support, and tools that they need. Now, as I mentioned previously, in my opinion, I think that the challenges of remote working can be broken down into three main areas, and those are as follows: productivity, communication, collaboration. Or from a QA-centric perspective, staying demonstratively productive, given the specifics and the somewhat nebulous nature of testing activities. Recording and sharing testing related information, outcomes and insights as they're needed by the rest of your team. And recording and communicating all of the bugs, issues, and all of the other stuff that testing produces in some format that is palatable to all of the people that need it, your teammates, your managers, and your stakeholders. So we're going to spend the rest of the webinar digging down into all of those areas a bit further. Now, if you've not been in the habit of working remotely much in the past, then starting to do so can be a bit of a culture shock. When you have to physically show up in an office, then the mere fact that you're physically present in that office can take some of the pressure away from actually being productive and getting stuff done. When you're fully remote, nobody can see when or if you're working, unless you've got some kind of Orwellian or Big Brother style monitoring set up by your employer, in which case you have my commiserations. In any event, what all of this means is that when you're working remotely, the likelihood is that you are being judged purely on what you actually get done, what you deliver. So the onus then is on you to manage your own time, stay focused, and keep people informed about what you're doing or not doing, and get the support that you need to overcome any challenges and make the necessary progress on your deliverables. As we all know, meetings are an anathema to productivity, so you should definitely avoid any unnecessary meetings where you can possibly do so. Emphasis on unnecessary meetings there. Obviously, in the strange times we're currently living in, staying in contact with people generally, and your teammates in particular, might be a bit more important for your mental health than usual. But trust me on this, even when you're remote and can potentially multitask during those meetings by answering the odd email or responding to Slack messages, whatever, and you shouldn't be doing that anyway, because multitasking is not great. Sitting in online meetings all day is not going to boost your productivity. For successful remote working, here's what I recommend. You must ruthlessly plan and guard your time against all unnecessary meetings and any other distracting activities. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. If you are not managing your time, then other people will manage it for you. And that, my friends, is a downward spiral to nowhere good. As Helmut van Moltke says, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Or more pithily from Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. You have got to be prepared for the kinds of things that are going to distract you from your plan when you're working remotely. Now, there's a few steps that you can take to mitigate the risk of distraction and unwelcome interruptions while you're working from your home or from wherever it is that you're working. Make sure you have a decent workspace in which to do your work from. So as you can see, I'm sat in my illustrious office at home. I appreciate, though, that not everybody has the benefit of a dedicated workspace. If you can set aside a regular space from which you can work, I'd certainly recommend doing so. If nothing else, it's going to serve as a kind of mental switch for when you need to take a break or finish for the day, since it's going to be a place that you can get up and walk away from. One of the problems of working remotely, of working from home, certainly in my experience, is that you're in danger of never actually stopping working. Having a dedicated workspace can help with this. Something else I've talked and written about in the past is that having a kind of den or bat cave type area in which you can do your work can be helpful as well. There's a framing effect which can take place if you've set up your work environment in such a way as to inspire and energize you. It's going to put you in the right frame of mind for doing your best work. In the worst case, if you can't set aside a more or less dedicated workspace, invest in some decent headphones. One of the most effective things for me is my pair of noise cancelling headphones. I drafted most of this webinar wearing them. They are like magic. Complete focus no matter where I am in the house or who is around me. I cannot recommend them enough. If you can't have a dedicated workspace, put on a pair of headphones instead. Stay off of social media. Shut down your email and whatever instant messaging tool your colleagues are using if you need additional focus or attention on your task or activity. So I think there's kind of a trust issue here, where just because you're working remotely, you're working at home or whatever, you feel like you have to be demonstratively online all of the time to prove that you are actually working. But in my opinion, this is the same kind of thing as if you just turn up at the office and simply by virtue of being in the office, you think that you're magically being productive. You're not. You need to take the view that your job is to deliver testing results, bugs, automation, or whatever else your team needs from you. And if you need to occasionally shut down some of those distracting notifications in order to deliver on that stuff, you should not be afraid to do so. Likewise, you shouldn't be afraid to take advantage of your remoteness and flexibility to work at times or in places when or where there are less distractions. Speaking personally, I do some of my best work over the weekend because nobody else is working. Now, I appreciate you may not want to work at the weekend, and that's fine, but there may be other times of the day that are better suited to you, for you to get things done, either because those times are quiet in terms of notifications, messages, emails, etc., or because they just work better in terms of your circadian rhythm. I would encourage you to try and identify and work with your own biorhythm. Figure out when you're most awake and alert, when you're at your most creative, and when you're at your least creative. For me, my most creative time is first thing in the morning. So I try, insofar as it's possible, not to have any meetings in the morning. If I can keep my mornings free, then that means I get, in the region of 2 to 4 hours of focused, productive time in which to get stuff done before everyone else starts coming online. I work with a lot of folk in the US, so they come online around midday, 1, 2 o'clock-ish, and that's when I start having my meetings. Don't multitask, even during meetings. If you find it hard to maintain your attention during meetings, then use those as an opportunity to develop your note-taking skills, which I'll come to in a few moments. Don't multitask. Stay focused on single activities at a time. Do them well, move on to the next one. Ruthlessly plan your week. Carve out large blocks of smart, creative time. So probably many of you will be familiar with days that look a little bit like this one. So these images were taken from a blog post by the renowned tester, Michael Bolton, not the singer. So you can find his blog post here on the slide. And in this example, Michael has, recorded some testing activity. So he's trying to get some testing done, but in order to get the work that he actually wants to do done, he's got to do a bunch of setup first. So that's the yellow stuff here. And then he gets all his setup done and he starts doing some testing, so testing, and then he finds a bug. And he's got to investigate that bug, he's got to reproduce it, he's got to capture some screenshots, etc. He's got to, record the steps to reproduce it, create a ticket, do all that kind of stuff. So he does all of that kind of stuff, and then he starts doing some testing again, testing, bug. More investigation, more recording, more screenshots. All right, now he's got to go back and reset his environment, so more setup work, etc. So, we all have days like this, and it may be that this relates to testing activities. It may be that it relates to, some other piece of work that you've got to get done. Ultimately, there's stuff that you've got to do before you can do the work that you actually want to do. And then there's distractions and issues and challenges that kind of get in the way of you actually finishing the piece of work that you're supposed to be delivering, right? We all know what days like this look like. And what we're aiming to do by planning our time ruthlessly is to minimize the amount of context switching between all of these different bits and pieces that comprise delivering on a piece of work. Now, we're never going to eliminate all of the extraneous stuff that needs doing, the yellow bits, and we're probably not going to completely eliminate all of the issues and distractions that arise, but we can try. What we're aiming for is a completely clear day. Probably this is never going to happen, or will very rarely happen. Certainly when I have days that look like this, I begin to wonder what's going on, why nobody's getting in contact with me, why nobody's answering me, asking me questions, or whether I'm doing my job right on that particular day. But, this is kind of a perfect day situation, isn't it, where we can just focus on the stuff that we actually need to do, right? More likely we're going to end up with something that looks a little bit more like this, where we've minimized the amount of additional stuff that we have to do, where we've minimized the context switching, where we've eliminated as many of the distractions as possible, so that there's a better chance of being more focused and therefore more productive during an average working day. So there's a guy called Cal Newport, and he talks about this kind of stuff a lot in his book, Deep Work. which is certainly a book that I've drawn a lot of inspiration from personally. And this image is from one of his articles about how he approaches his daily planning. So you can see basically what he's doing is chunking his time into different areas and trying to set aside large blocks of time for deep work, focused work on a single deliverable or whatever it is you're doing. Now, I don't have quite the same approach as Cal Newport, and I'm not as visual about tracking my time as he or Michael Bolton are, but I am in the habit of planning my work ahead of time. So, usually on like a Sunday night, you're going to find me planning my week ahead. That might always happen. It might be a Friday, or it might be first thing on a Monday if I've been crunched. But I plan my work ahead of time. I also review my next day's work before I finish the previous day's work every day. Planning my work generally involves checking my calendar for meetings that are already scheduled, scheduling any additional meetings that I'm running, and then planning how I'm going to utilize all of my remaining time. It doesn't need to be rigid. Tyson's quote about planning refers, but I do need to have a good sense of what I'm going to be working on a daily basis so that I can make sure I've got those large blocks of focused time in which to get stuff done. So this to me is one of the keys of actually getting stuff done generally and really excelling in your career. Whether you're working remotely or not, if the work you're doing revolves around smart, creative problem solving, then you're going to need blocks of focused time in which to think creatively about the problems you're trying to solve. The more and larger blocks of time you can fit into your working week in order to focus on high value activities, the more effective, productive, and better you're going to be. So you can check out this book from Cal Newport, Deep Work, if you want some more information about that. Yeah. So I mentioned mornings are my most creative time in terms of thinking. That works out pretty nicely for me, but it's by design. I would strongly encourage you to spend some time thinking about how you work, what the best, most creative, most productive times are for you, and schedule your work accordingly. You may not be completely in control of your own time, but to the extent that you can, you should definitely be proactive in attempting to manage your time so that other people don't manage it for you. Just before I move on to the next thing, another benefit of really spending that time planning out your activities can help you with reflecting on your work as well, identifying how you're spending your time and spotting opportunities for improving how you're utilizing your time is going to pay you dividends over the long term. And for this reason, among many others, I heartily recommend keeping some kind of journal and recording detailed notes about your daily activities. Now, depending on your degree of interest in such things, you may have observed that folk in the testing community can be pretty hardcore about how they take notes in relation to their testing activities and stuff generally, and what they use to record their notes with. The activity and thought process behind how and what I use to take notes is something I've written about in the past. I'm a bit of a note-taking nerd. And there are plenty of other good articles about the mechanics of note-taking out there as well. So, some of the folk that spring to mind, Alan Richardson, Evil Tester, John Stevenson, Ziga Van Hees, and James Bark, and Michael Bolton, who I've already mentioned. Of course, the what and the how aren't really important unless you're taking notes in the first place. So that's my first communication pro tip. Take notes obsessively, since you never know when they're going to come in handy, both for you and for your teammates. And it's this second point that makes me lean more towards electronic methods of note taking, particularly for general sort of work purposes, because it's going to make your notes much easier to share with your colleagues should you need to do so. I've been using Evernote for this purpose for as long as I can remember. Well, since about 2010. And obviously there are lots of other tools out there that will do much the same job as Evernote very capably. But whichever tool you decide to use, there are a few key characteristics that I recommend looking for before you make a final decision. So you should be able to record your notes easily and quickly. You should be able to take notes anywhere you are. So ideally, you know, the app, if there is one, should be available on your phone, for example, because chances are you're always going to have that with you, and you can always pull it out and take notes anytime you need to. You should be able to find your notes easily when you need them, so that implies some kind of search functionality. And you should be able to share your notes easily with others. And probably it's just on this final hurdle that Evernote falls down slightly for me, since I use my own personal account and I don't feel like sharing that with my colleagues generally. But there's always copy and paste. And that's the main benefit of recording your notes digitally in any event. So I'm going to mention that I usually have at least two and sometimes more than two paper notepads on the go at any point in time. So at a minimum, I've got a notepad for journaling, reflection, and learning activities. So I use this to record, you know, quotes, notes from books, thoughts, etc. And then I've got another notebook for work. And I use that to record all my notes from various work activities, meetings, write down to-do lists, brainstorming, etc. So my own personal preference is for my personal notebook to be relatively high quality. So I use a Moleskine for that usually. And for the work notebook, potentially to be somewhat lower quality, since there's a good likelihood that I'm just going to throw it away once I'm done, although often that's a Moleskine as well. Probably that's a bit too much information for everybody. Sorry about that. The key point about having paper as well as digital notebooks, though, is that it has been, I think, fairly well established at this point that when you write something down, you remember it better. When you just type something, it doesn't get retained so well. There's a kind of pass-through effect. Because you're typing it, you don't retain it. A similar thing happens when you're taking photos. Actually, if you're taking a photo of, for example, a landscape, it's going to affect your memory. It has the same kind of pass-through effect. If you really want to remember something, then you just need to avoid digital devices, basically. And certainly for the purposes of note-taking, writing stuff down is definitely going to help you retain information better than recording that same information digitally. There's plenty of other benefits to keeping a journal and physically writing stuff down as well. I'm not going to dwell on those too much during this specific webinar, though I'd certainly recommend taking a look at some of the blog posts I mentioned, and you know, maybe let us know if that's something you'd like to hear more about in a future webinar. The point that I'm driving towards, though, is that if you are working remotely, writing is a key skill. Your remote colleagues, excuse me, your remote colleagues have got to understand what you're saying quickly and easily. If you're writing it to them in a Slack channel or, you know, some other instant messaging tool, for example, you need the capability to transmit what is in your head to other members of your team using the written word, particularly when working remotely. Often, you're going to need to persuade other people of your point of view when you're trying to explain why that bug you found is a showstopper, for example. So you need to understand how to write your thinking down using sufficiently persuasive language to be able to communicate to people what is in your head and convince them of its accuracy. So, you know, as this guy's saying here. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of copywriting. Historically, the copywriting profession has revolved around the writing of advertisement text or copy, with a view towards keeping the advertising message succinct, clear, and persuasive, aka hypnotic, the image. It's also an area that Alan Richardson has spoken and written about in the past as well. I think it's a skill that has much wider application these days, geared as it is towards clear, succinct, and persuasive written or spoken communication. As such, it's probably worth a few minutes of your time, at least investigating the concept and getting a feel for whether it's something you're interested in looking more deeply into. As a general rule of thumb, though, I'd suggest that anything which benefits your general communication skills is going to serve you well over the course of your career and is going to help you work more effectively with your teammates remotely. Ultimately, you're going to need to communicate with your colleagues while you're working remote. And a lot of that communication is going to take place in instant messaging channels, in tickets, and in other tools as writing. So it's worth paying some attention to. Hot on the heels of communicating your thinking using the written word is going to be doing the same thing with the spoken word. Learning to effectively use the tools that are going to allow you to collaborate more effectively with your colleagues when working remotely. Probably over the last few weeks or so, if you're new to the whole remote working thing, you'll have gotten at least a little bit used to the idea of remote meetings. Certainly my daughters have. They're currently spending several hours a day in Zoom meetings for their various after-school activities. So probably you're using whatever your preferred or company mandated tool is for joining those meetings. And facilitation is kind of the key word that I'm going to dwell on here. If you want to get really good at working remotely, you need to go a few steps beyond just participating in online meetings. And I'm not just talking about formal meetings here either. There's going to be lots of opportunities for ad hoc meetings with developers and colleagues to discuss challenges or share your thoughts over bugs and issues. So my recommendation is, you know, not to just passively attend remote meetings. You should be aiming and towards and getting used to starting and facilitating online meetings, making sure you've got a good set of headphones with a decent microphone for speaking during those meetings. And here's another pro tip: do not use Bluetooth. Bluetooth mics on laptops are limited to 16 kilohertz. They sound terrible, and they introduce an additional couple of hundred milliseconds of extra latency to all of your communication. You should use wired headphones for conference calls. Try to make sure your Wi-Fi is working optimally, so you're not suffering from more lag or jitter than is absolutely necessary. So probably it's at this point that my team tells me my connection has been absolutely atrocious throughout the entire webinar. I'm just checking to see that that's not the case, and that looks good. So I recommend having a backup internet source as well, in case your main one goes down. If you're working remotely for the long haul, consider taking out an unlimited data mobile plan so that you've got a backup if you need it, but also so that you've then got the option of using that unlimited data plan wherever you are. In effect, that's going to mean that wherever your phone is, you can be working, which I've found incredibly helpful in the past. You should try and get comfortable with sharing your screen, sharing generally, walking through your thinking with demonstrations and supporting documentation or other materials. The bonus points, get on camera. We all know by now that physicality makes up a large proportion of effective communication. The precise ratio, I think, is somewhat open to debate, but it makes up a lot of the communication bandwidth. Opening up your camera and looking your colleagues in the virtual eye while speaking to them is a good way to bridge the communication barrier while working remote. Okay, so at this point, I've talked quite a bit about some general strategies for better remote working that cluster around 3 general areas: productivity, communication, and collaboration, in reverse order there. I've tried to keep things pretty general since this is, as I understand it, a general audience. It's not one that's made up solely of testers or QA teams. But the original premise for the webinar was, how can QA testers stay productive if they're struggling due to remote working? I think that the general tips that I've already mentioned are going to go a long way towards addressing any immediate issues. So in terms of communication, learn to take lots of notes, improve your writing skills, improve your speaking and listening skills for all those online meetings. Become a master of collaboration tools. Learn to facilitate, not just participate, all of those meetings. And in terms of general productivity, manage your time, eliminate distractions, tell people when you're blocked, but be proactive in planning and managing your work. Use your remoteness if you want, and reflect on your processes so you can identify areas for improvement. I think the skills that I've mentioned build on each other, which is why I've represented them in this way. Better communication leads to better collaboration, which leads to improved productivity. Now, what I haven't done during this webinar is mention another main thing that's going to help testers specifically out a bunch, and that's the use of a test management tool. TestRail specifically. I'd be remiss not to at least mention it, right? So it's this final point that I'm going to conclude with. If you're a QA or a QA team and you're working remote, then you're going to discover, or may have already discovered, that trying to manage your testing activities without using some kind of dedicated test management tool just doesn't scale very well. You can use a shared spreadsheet or some other form of shared documentation, but ultimately the complexities of managing your test activities across your team, particularly when they're working remotely, is going to mean that some additional tooling is very helpful. The remote working strategies I've already mentioned will 10x your effectiveness in some areas if you are struggling. But a test management tool can 100x your effectiveness, and that's where TestRail comes in. When you're working remotely, you need a tool that supports all of your existing testing processes without adding unnecessary constraints. I've got no issues with recommending TestRail as the test management tool for doing this, not just because I'm the TestRail product manager, and not just because before I joined the TestRail team as product manager, I used TestRail as both a tester and a test manager. No, it's not just me recommending TestRail, it's our users and the testing community. As you can see from this G2 test management grid, in which TestRail wins most implementable tool in this category, along with best relationship, best usability, and users love us awards, among many others. TestRail helps with your testing productivity by providing you with a repository for all of your testing stuff, along with the tools, and workflows that you need to handle all of your testing. And it's going to provide you with the mechanisms that you need to communicate and share all of your testing information across your team. You can create all of your test cases directly inside of TestRail, and you can organize your tests into runs and plans using whatever approach makes sense for your team and product. And you can execute all of your tests once you've organized them all in TestRail, recording your testing observations, results, and any other information such as logs and screenshots by attaching them to the test results or comments. The TestRail is going to help your team to collaborate. You can track the quality of your products using the out-of-the-box statuses and TestRail dashboards for runs, plans, and milestones. You can use the TestRail API to integrate with a huge number of tools and frameworks, and TestRail scales with your team if you need it to, providing single sign-on, auditing, configurable backups and restorations, and performance optimizations to enterprise tier customers. Obviously, I haven't had a lot of time to focus on TestRail specifically during this webinar, and that was by design. During this webinar, I wanted to share with you some thoughts about how you can accomplish your work more effectively when you're in a remote situation. And hopefully the thoughts that I've shared with you will go some way towards doing that. If you are in the market for a test management tool though, I'll be back here tomorrow with a somewhat more in-depth introduction to TestRail. And you can join me then if you want to for the Meet TestRail webinar. If you're interested in a much more thorough exploration of all of TestRail's capabilities, then you can join my colleagues Jacob and David on Thursday for the Starting to Test with TestRail webinar. At this point though, I am done, and I think we do have around 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. So I'm not sure whether David's going to join me for this bit. I'm going to check my chat console there and see whether we've got some questions come in. Okay, let me just grab a quick sip of water while I read through some of those. Okay, so I've got a question here. Did you try to copy your work routine, or did you settle into a new routine? It's kind of an interesting question. I've been working remotely for quite a number of years now, and I guess during that time I have settled into a way of working that works for me, and I'm just aiming to kind of share the benefit of having gone through that process with all of you on this webinar. I think it kind of depends to some extent on your specific situation. So for me, most of the team that I work with is either in the US, which means they don't wake up until sort of 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, because I'm based in the UK. I also work with lots of colleagues in Eastern Europe and in India, and other places in the world as well, some of whom start a lot earlier than me as well. Ultimately, I still take the same basic approach, which is to plan my week well in advance, and to identify what meetings I've got coming up, what meetings I need to organize and all of that kind of stuff, and cluster all of those things together to the extent I'm able to do so. So generally speaking, I have all of my meetings in the afternoon, and I try to do all of my sort of productive, focused work first thing in the morning, because A, that's when no meetings are taking place, and B, that's when I'm at my most creative, energetic, analytical, etc. Anyway, depending on what your team looks like, maybe your meetings will all take place in the morning, and afternoons are when you can kind of sit down and be more productive. And if that works for you, great. You know, ultimately, it's just, you just need to kind of go through the process of figuring out when the best times are for you, what fits in with your team. And then, as I mentioned throughout the webinar, trying to carve out those large blocks of time so that you can really dig into your work and be focused and undistracted while you're working on stuff. So there's another question here. What are your suggestions to plan for the week when the person has some large chunks of free time during the week? Well, I think I just answered that question, to be honest. I think that's pretty much the same as the previous question. I mean, just to riff on that a little bit more, as I mentioned again during the webinar, I take time to try and plan out my week before the week actually starts proper. So often for me, that means an hour or so on a Sunday night, just looking at the week ahead, seeing what meetings and things like that I've got scheduled, and then taking a look at my to-do list, figuring out what deliverables I need to be working on, and then setting aside blocks of time to actually work on those deliverables. I mentioned Cal Newport during the webinar a bit. I mean, obviously he's written an entire book on the subject of deep work. I highly recommend picking up a copy of that book if you're able to do so. I mean, I've applied that thinking in general to working on deliverables, specific sort of work products. But the other thing that you might think about using that time for is learning activities. For example, you know, if you want to learn some new skills, then set aside blocks of time for doing that. If you need to carry out some kind of research as part of your working week, you know, set aside time for doing that. In his book, Cal Newport talks about how he used to spend a lot of time reading research papers during his focus time, and trying to research those and come up with answers for the kinds of problems that he saw in the research papers that he was interested in. And that's something that I've tried to do with not a huge amount of success, if I'm honest. But you know, it's certainly the kind of thing that you could use those large blocks of time for. What kind of headphones does Simon use, and what kind of music do you listen to stay in focus? I'm not going to advertise my my headphones. I've got a fairly expensive pair of noise cancelling headphones. I'll be honest, they are absolutely worth their weight in gold, and if you can afford to spend a little bit of money on a decent pair, I'd highly recommend you do so. What kind of music do I listen to stay in focus? As a general rule, if I want to be focused, I tend to listen to music that doesn't have words in it, because I find vocals a distraction. So if I really want to focus on something, then you know I'll listen to something that is relatively ambient in nature. Do we have any more questions? I'm not seeing any further questions related to the topic in question. So if we don't, and I don't think we do, I will probably wrap up at this point and give you all 2 or 3 minutes of your hour back. Yeah, I can see one final question in here. What collaboration tool have you found most useful? I'm gonna refer back to what I talked about during the webinar, and I'm going to say keeping good notes. Learning to take good notes and being able to share my thoughts, my observations, the content of those notes with the rest of my team when I need to. The other collaboration tool that I rely on quite a bit is mind maps, and a lot of my team will certainly testify to my usage of those, certainly when I'm sharing screens and sort of brainstorming with other people and stuff like that. Okay, I'm gonna call it. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Please do stay in touch with us. You can get in contact with us via the contact@gurup.com email address or via any one of our websites. So just search for TestRail, Kiwan, Travis, Assembler, or RunnerX. Once again, thank you everybody for joining. We have webinars tomorrow and Thursday, as I already mentioned. I'm doing the webinar tomorrow. So if you want to join me for that, hopefully I'll see you there. Thank you very much and goodbye.